We're going to be in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 24. It's between Ruth and 2 Samuel, for those of you who've not been vigorously reading from the prophet Samuel. And so I want to give you a moment just to turn there if you have a Bible. 1 Samuel chapter 24. It's a story that's 3,000 plus years old, but I hope will have some relevance for us today. 1 Samuel 24. Now, before we start with that, I want to share with you a proverb. It comes from Proverbs 22, and it says this: sensible people see trouble coming and take precaution, but an unthinking person or a fool will walk right into it and regret it later. Let me say that again. Sensible people see trouble coming and take precaution, but an unthinking person will walk right into it and regret it later. Now, that being said, I'd like to think that I'm a pretty sensible person, thoughtful, intentional. For the most part, I'd like to think of myself as sensible, but sometimes I can get impatient. You know, I want what I want, and I want it now. And so sometimes when I grow impatient, I can foolishly walk right into it. And just about every time that I do, I regret it. You ever do that? You ever walk right into it? You have those times where you have a check in your spirit, sort of a gut feeling. Maybe you feel you would use the language of God's prompting, your conscience speaking to you, telling you just to slow down, to stop, to pay attention to what's going on in front of you before you move forward, and you just don't do it. Anybody ever do that? I'm sure you probably haven't. But for those who have, there could be a number of different reasons why. But to be honest, none of the reasons really matter, because the end result is almost always regret. Now, I remember several years ago when I was training for a triathlon, that part of the portion of my training was the swimming aspect. And when I would train for the swimming, because it took me 20 minutes to get to the ocean and an hour to swim and 20 minutes to get back, I needed to start before the sun came up. And so I would time it such that when I woke up, and I'm not really an early morning person, but I would time it on those mornings where I was doing my swims, that I would get there just as the sun was coming up. I wasn't really all that much into swimming in the dark in the ocean. So I would get there just as the sun was coming up. And one morning I remember getting there, and clearly planted in the beach was a red flag that was waving, literally a red flag waving in the breeze. Now, for most of you guys who have been to the beach and you've seen this before, you know that that red flag means caution or stay out, you fool. But as I looked at it, I thought to myself, I've already gotten up and gotten here. I've got to get this training in. My race is about a month away. That red flag doesn't really apply to me. So I looked at the surf, and as the sun was coming up, I could see that it was breaking really hard. It was very rough. But my thought was, if I get on the other side of that, about 25 or 30 yards, it's rough, but it's not as rough as getting over the breaker. So all I need to do is just get through that, and I'll be fine. And then I'll swim parallel to the shore and do my training. So seeing the red flag waving in the breeze and hearing and watching the crashing of the waves on the beach, knowing that it is advised not to go in, what do you think I did? I went in. I went right into it. It took me a little bit to get over the breakers, but once I did, it was rough, but it was doable. And so I started swimming until this huge wave picked me up and deposited me on the beach. Now, I was about 30 yards out. So you can imagine how rough it would be as this wave is taking me in and depositing me on the beach. Some of you guys have been there, whether you've been swimming or you've been there where waves come in and they cause you to tumble, you get sand in your trunks, you're disoriented, you get up, another wave hits you. Well, that's what happened to me. I was a pretty good swimmer, but like this wave or series of waves just crushed me. And so as I gathered myself, I looked back at the surf and I thought to myself, all right, I've only really been in 5 or 6 minutes. I haven't gotten my hour in. I haven't gotten what I paid for. I need to get back out there. And I looked back at the shore and I saw the red flag and I saw the surf. And so what do you think I did? Do you think I did the wise thing or the foolish thing? If you know me, you know I did the foolish thing. I went back out once again over the harsh surf, breakers, get to the other side, started my swim. It was rough, but it was doable until the exact same thing about 5, 6, 7 minutes happened once again. Same thing. And I'm standing there and I'm thinking to myself, this is not very fun. But I have a race in a month and I really need to train. So I don't know what to do. Now, anybody who's not a fool at this point should know what to do. You were warned not to go in. You have been physically dropped on the beach from 30 yards out by a series of waves twice. So what do you think at that moment I did? I'm not as big a fool as you think I am. Finally, after the second one, I took my wetsuit and went home. Thankful that my life wasn't that morning taken, because in all reality, I could have died that morning. There's a reason why red flags are planted in the sand to warn you not to go in when the surf is dangerous. And if that wasn't enough, I had to be reminded on 2 separate occasions that this is more powerful than you. I had a gut check. I had tension. My conscience was speaking to me, but I just overrode it because I had a race that I was training for. Looking back now, it seems silly, but in the moment, I rushed in. And while my life was spared, I do regret it. I can proudly say to you, since that time, I've never done the same thing again. I hope I've learned my lesson. Now, I'm pretty sure none of you guys would do anything like that for sure. But I wonder, how about a business deal where you're in a rush to meet a deadline? And because time is pressing, you cut a corner or two, even though you know it's not right. You compromise the deal on some level. Maybe you compromised your character with the decision that you made. But because you were pressed for time, you made a decision that your gut said, don't do this. Do what is right, but you pressed in and you went forward anyway. Or how about with a purchase where you have credit card debt out the wazoo, and yet you saw something that you wanted. It was shiny and new, fill in the blank, and you said to yourself, I know I have debt. I know I can't afford this, but I do have enough room on my credit card left that I can get it now. I know I'll pick it back up. And you bought it anyway. Or maybe you're in a relationship where you're just so tired of being alone, looking for Mr. Right or Mrs. Right, that you were just so tired of being alone that when this person finally came along and the red flag was blowing in the wind and you saw all of the issues that warned you, listen, pause, take a chill pill, stop. Don't relax your standards. Don't settle for someone that's not right for you. And yet you kept moving forward anyway because you were just tired of being alone. You know, whatever the case, it happens in a variety of ways where we push past these red flags that are waving in the breeze, warning us to take caution. But sometimes we just don't do it. Now, we're in week 4 of a series called Hey Siri. And each week, I've been giving you a simple question to ask yourself when making important decisions that would dramatically increase your level of clarity and reduce your level of regret. This week, I want to give you the question that I'm calling the conscience question. And that is this: is there a tension that deserves my attention? Is there a tension that deserves my attention? Now, inevitably, when each of us are making decisions, we will have a sense that something isn't quite right. And when it occurs, we owe it to ourselves to stop and pay attention to the tension. And as we do, to ask ourselves, what is it about this situation that is bothering me? Because when we take the time to do so, it increases the likelihood that we're going to make a better decision. If something bothers us, we just need to let it bother us. That job offer, that conversation we had, that invitation, we need to let it bother us until it either goes away or we decide to go a different way. And so there's this great story in 1 Samuel chapter 24 about King David, long before he actually becomes the king, that illustrates this principle really well. You see, one day while he was tending sheep, a prophet showed up at his home and announced to his family that God had chosen him to be the next king of Israel. There's only one problem with this great news that he and his family received, and that was that Israel already had a king by the name of Saul. And as you might imagine, Saul wasn't going to take the news of being replaced very well. So Samuel anoints David to be the next king, but while he waits for the change, he went from shepherd to soldier in King Saul's army. And before long, because of his great skill and courage in battle, his popularity overshadowed that of the king. Saul, on the other hand, became so jealous that he tried to kill David. And so David fled the city and became a fugitive on the run. But his reputation became so great as the days and weeks and months passed that hundreds of other fugitives and outlaws flocked to his side. And before long, he had a small army of his own. And that is where we pick up the story today. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. And Saul returned from fighting the Philistines. He was told that David had gone into the wilderness of En-gedi. So Saul chose 3,000 elite troops from all Israel and went to search for David and his men near the rocks of the wild goats, at the place where the road passes some sheepfolds. Saul went into a cave to relieve himself. But as it happened, David and his men were hiding further back in that very cave. Let's stop for a second. So you get the picture? Saul and his 3,000 men are out looking for David in the wilderness in a place called En-gedi. It's the western shore of the Dead Sea in the southern part of Israel. And as they're looking for David, nature calls. And so King Saul goes inside one of the hundreds or thousands of possible caves in that area for a little privacy to do his business. And of all of the possible caves to enter into, he ends up into the one that David and his men were already hiding in. I mean, what are the chances? Now, when David and his men realize that Saul is headed in their direction, they move back just a little bit further into the recesses and the darkness of the cave. Now, their eyes have had time to adjust to the dark, but Saul, having just stepped in from the bright Middle Eastern sun, he can't see a thing. Not thinking anything, he disrobes, squats down, and begins to do his thing. Now, clearly, this must be a sign for David, right? Saul is being delivered up for David on a platter. Everybody in Israel knew that David was the next king. The only thing that stood in his way was the current king. So listen to what his men say as Saul does his business to David. They say, "Now's your opportunity. Today the Lord is telling you," this is their God talk, "today the Lord is telling you, I will certainly put your enemy into your power to do with as you wish." So many days and so many nights on the run, hiding, fearing for their lives with bounties on their heads. The timing, it just couldn't have been more perfect to end this very, very long season of their lives. Their word is, God must have given you this opportunity. Just kill the king and head home to your new reign. There'd be no civil war. Thousands of lives would be spared. This was just this was a no-brainer decision to be made. It was simply a matter of killing the king before the king killed David. Besides, what else were they going to do? Remain outlaws for the rest of their lives? This needed to end, and now was the perfect time to end it. The only problem, though, was that David felt a tension. There was something that wasn't quite right. So, what does he do? We pick the story back up. It said, David creeped up behind Saul, and instead of killing him, he cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. But then his conscience began bothering him because he had cut off Saul's robe. He went back then and said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this to my lord the king. I should not attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord himself has chosen him. He's just a few feet away from Saul. But David becomes, in this moment, conscience-stricken. And in this moment, midstream, he stops. He's ready to slit the king's throat. But he stops and he pays attention to the tension that he was feeling. And he changed his course of action. Instead of murdering Saul, he cuts off the back portion of his robe, and he then goes back into the depths of the cave to tell his men, but they're shocked at his decision. Saul then exits the cave, having no clue as to just how close he came to his own demise, rejoins his men, and then prepares to continue his search for David, when suddenly he hears a voice coming from the cave that he just departed. Verse 8, David came out and shouted after him, my lord, the king. And when Saul looked around, David bowed down low before him. And then he shouted to Saul, why do you listen to the people who say that I'm trying to harm you? This very day you can see with your own eyes, it just isn't true. For the Lord placed you at my mercy, back there in the cave. This is where he throws his friends under the bus. He says, some of my men told me to kill you, but I didn't. I spared you. For I said, I will never harm the king, for he is the Lord's anointed one. Now look, my father, at what I have in my hand. It's a piece of the hem of your robe. I cut it off, but I didn't kill you. Now this proves that I am not trying to harm you, and that I have not sinned against you, even though you've been hunting for me to kill me. Now may the Lord judge between us. Perhaps the Lord will punish you for what you are trying to do to me, but I will never harm you. He said, no matter what you try to do to me, I will not respond in kind. I will wait and allow God to determine the outcome of this conflict. I will not take matters into my own hands, as easy as it might be. I will not play God in your life, and I will not play God in mine. I will not let your bad behavior determine my decisions. What integrity in this moment for him to pause and listen to his conscience, to stop when he could have had everything that he wanted. It would have changed his life dramatically. It would have put an end to all of his long days of being on the run and suffering with great fear that maybe today was the day. He could have put an end to all of that. But he stopped mid-course and listened to the voice saying to him, this is not how you want to be remembered. One day when you're telling stories to your grandchildren, you don't want them to hear about how you inherited the kingdom by slitting the throat of the previous king while he was taking a dump. You just don't want that story told. How do you think, though, as this plays itself out, old King Saul is going to respond? Do you think he's going to charge the cave? Do you think he's going to be humble in his response? Listen to what happens in this story. It's so great. It says, and then King Saul begins to weep. Verse 17, he begins to weep, and he says to David, check this out, you are a better man than I am, for you have repaid me good for evil. Yes, you have been amazingly kind to me today. For when the Lord put me in a place where you could have killed me, you didn't do it. Who else would let his enemy get away when he had him right there in his grasp? May the Lord reward you well for the kindness that you have shown me today. And now I realize that you are surely going to be the king, and that the kingdom of Israel will flourish under your rule. Never before and never afterwards would King Saul show such humility. He says to David, you're just a better man than I am. Every single thing about the way that you did what you did today, none of it would I have done. You are amazing. And when you become king, I know that our nation will flourish under your leadership. Wow. All because David paid attention to the tension. Now, I cannot say with certainty that every time we do this, that the outcome is going to be as favorable as David was in this instance. Sometimes we can pay attention to the tension. We can let what's bothering us bother us, and we can make a different decision. We can change our course of direction, and it still may not turn out the way that we want it to. But what I can say is that when we push past the tension and we override our conscience, we are always setting ourselves up for the possibility of deep regret. You see, people who are willing to yield to God's promptings, to listen for his voice, set themselves up for making wise choices and very difficult decisions. So, the next time you're feeling uneasy, I just want you to slow down, and I want you to remember what David did. Maybe even stop and ask yourself, is there a tension that deserves my attention? And if there is, then let it bother you until you know why it is that it's bothering you. Because the tension may very well be God's way of protecting you. It may be God's way of waving you off of a decision that you will later regret. Now, looking back over the course of our lives, all of us could probably look back and think about things that we wish that we would have pushed the pause button on, that we wished we would have stopped, that we wouldn't have plunged forward, that we wouldn't have walked right into it. Things that hindsight teaches us that we don't have in the moment. But what we do have in the moment is a conscience, is a gut check, is a prompting, is a tension. You put whatever language you want on it. All of us have that. And in those moments, how much more likely will it be that we would make wise decisions if we would just stop and consider the tension? Some of us are living with decisions, not even just one, but maybe a series of decisions that as we look back, we really regret. If we would have done it differently, we might have had a different result. We might have been on a different path. Things might look different with our families, with our job, within ourselves. Would that we pay attention to the tension? Now, for those of us who live in a place of regret, there is mercy and grace. There is redemption that is possible. We do not always need to live under the shame of bad decisions, mistakes, failures, regrets. We can be liberated from those, and we must. But moving forward, let's just be smart. Let's just be sensible. Let's just be thoughtful. Let's just be intentional. Because that tension, when it comes, it's there for a reason. So I want you to pay attention to it so that your list of regrets will diminish and your level of clarity and confidence in moving forward will increase. As you think about that, let's together pray. Father, we thank you for wisdom, 3,000-year-old wisdom from a man who could have made a very different decision. It would have been so easy to have made a different decision. But that decision ultimately determined the legacy of that man. Now, we never know in any instant what one decision is going to lead to the next and then to the next. and what that outcome is going to be, but we do know that it sets us on a course. It determines our direction, it shapes our future, and so too our characters. So let us be mindful in every moment where we feel something that isn't quite right, that we would have the courage and the patience to slow down and to let what bothers us bother us until it no longer does. And in the end, God, we will be grateful for all of the ways in which you spared us for things that could have much easily ended in great disaster. In Christ we pray. Amen.